The first bouquet appeared on a Friday, and Dorian Cole almost threw it in the trash. White lilies, wrapped in brown paper, no card, no name, sitting on the welcome mat like they had grown there overnight. He stood in the doorway in his hospital scrubs, exhausted after a double shift, staring at them the way a man stares at something that doesn't belong in his life anymore. Flowers meant celebrations. Anniversaries. Apologies. He hadn't had any of those in 3 years, not since the funeral. He almost missed the second bouquet the following Friday. He didn't miss the third. By the fourth week, Dorian stopped believing it was a mistake. Before we continue, if you believe grief has a way of finding the people who understand it best, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Midnight Tales for more stories like this one. Dorian was 36, a hospital orderly who worked nights so he could be home when his daughter, Nora, woke up for school. His wife, Elise, had died of a brain aneurysm 4 years earlier, no warning, no goodbye, just an ordinary Tuesday that ended in a hospital corridor with machines that wouldn't stop beeping. Since then, Dorian had built his whole life around one goal, making sure 7-year-old Nora never felt the absence he felt every single day. He packed her lunches with little notes tucked inside. He learned to braid hair from a video at 6 a.m. He smiled so often for her sake that some mornings he forgot it wasn't real anymore. He didn't have room in his life for a mystery. But the flowers kept coming. On the 5th Friday, he waited by the window until he saw her, an elderly woman, maybe 70, moving slowly down the sidewalk with a wooden cane and a canvas bag looped over one thin shoulder. She set the bouquet down without knocking, paused for a moment too long, and then continued on, her eyes fixed somewhere past his door, as if she were looking at something that wasn't there anymore. Dorian stepped outside. "Ma'am, I think these might be for the wrong house." The woman startled, gripping her cane tighter. For a moment, something flickered across her face, not confusion, but fear. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I'll stop." She didn't give her name. She didn't explain. She just walked away faster than her cane should have allowed, and Dorian stood there holding lilies he didn't understand. They didn't stop. Over the following weeks, Dorian learned small things without meaning to. Her name was Margaret Wren, the neighbors called her the Flower Lady, said she'd lived 2 streets over for as long as anyone could remember, always alone, always polite, never unkind, but never close to anyone either. Some said her mind wandered. Others said she simply preferred silence. Dorian started leaving his porch light on for her. Small things. A folding chair by the door in case her hip ached. A thermos of tea on cold mornings. He never asked her to explain the flowers again, he simply let her come, the way you let a stray cat return to your yard, understanding without demanding to understand. Sometimes the smallest kindness isn't the one someone gives you. It's the one you decide not to question. Then one evening, Nora saw her. The little girl had been drawing on the porch steps when Margaret arrived with that week's bouquet. Instead of hiding, Nora looked up and smiled, the same open, unguarded smile she gave everyone, the one that hadn't yet learned suspicion. Margaret froze completely, the flowers trembling in her hand. "You have her eyes," Margaret whispered. "Whose eyes?" Nora asked. Margaret didn't answer. She set the lilies down, turned, and walked away faster than Dorian had ever seen her move. That night, Dorian couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and turned the question over and over. "You have her eyes. Whose eyes?" He thought about the house, a small rental he'd taken over 4 years ago, after Elise died, needing somewhere smaller, cheaper, somewhere that didn't hold their old life in every corner. He'd never once wondered who lived there before him. He found the answer 2 days later in the attic, tucked behind a water heater he'd been meaning to replace, a shoebox someone had left behind, forgotten by whoever managed the property between tenants. Inside were photographs. A little girl with dark curls, maybe 7 years old, laughing on the exact same porch steps where Nora now drew her pictures. On the back of one photo, in fading pencil, "Sylvie, age 7, our house." Dorian sat on the attic floor a long time before he understood. If you've ever discovered a truth that changed how you saw someone completely, you already know what happened next. He found Margaret's address through the church 2 streets over. The pastor recognized the name instantly, his expression softening into something careful. "Margaret lost her daughter in that house," he said. Nearly 40 years ago now. Sylvie was 7. A fever nobody caught in time. Margaret never remarried, never really left the neighborhood. Every year, on the Friday closest to Sylvie's birthday, she'd bring flowers to that door, no matter who lived there. Been doing it longer than most of us have lived here. Dorian stood on Margaret's porch that evening with the shoebox in his hands, unsure what he was about to give back. An old woman's grief returned to her doorstep the way she'd been returning it to his for weeks. Margaret opened the door already crying, as though she'd known this conversation was coming since the day Nora smiled at her. "I wasn't trying to frighten your daughter," she said, voice breaking. I promised her. I promised Sylvie I'd keep bringing flowers to that house as long as I was alive. It never mattered who lived there. It was never about them. It was about not letting her be forgotten." She looked down at her trembling hands. "But your little girl, she has this way of looking at people, like she isn't afraid of anything yet. It undid something in me I thought I'd buried." Dorian sat down beside her on the step, the way she had once sat several feet from a stranger's grief without demanding an explanation. "You didn't scare her," he said. "You gave her someone to wave at every Friday. That's not nothing. Not to a kid who lost her mother, either." Margaret looked up sharply. "You." "4 years ago," Dorian said. "So I understand a little bit about promises you make to people who aren't here anymore." They sat in silence, two people who had been keeping vigils in the same small house for entirely different ghosts, until Margaret finally said, "Would it be strange if sometimes I still brought them? Not out of habit anymore. Because I'd like to know your daughter." "It wouldn't be strange at all," Dorian said. "It might be exactly what both of them need. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who understands quiet grief, and subscribe to Midnight Tales for more stories about the people we don't expect to change us." Months later, the flowers still arrived every Friday, but no longer left silently on the mat. Margaret carried them to the door herself now, and Nora ran out to meet her before she reached the steps, already talking about her week, already asking questions Margaret answered slowly, carefully, like she was relearning a language she'd once loved. Dorian watched them from the kitchen window sometimes, coffee in hand, and felt something in his chest that had been closed for 4 years begin, very quietly, to open. Margaret never stopped grieving Sylvie. Some wounds don't close, they simply learn to share space with something new. But she stopped grieving alone, and so did Dorian, and so, in her own small way, did Nora, who never met the girl in the photographs but somehow understood, without being told, that being loved by someone who had lost everything was its own kind of gift. The flowers had never really been for Dorian's door. They were for a promise, kept for 40 years by a woman nobody thought to ask about. But somewhere along the way, without either of them planning it, the flowers stopped being about the past, and became the beginning of something neither of them expected to find again. And sometimes, the people who seem the loneliest are the ones still keeping the gentlest promises, waiting only for someone to finally ask who the flowers were really for.